MINI has been making hot variants of their cars since the acquisition of John Cooper Works many decades ago. However, this is the first time in Malaysia that we're seeing the JCW badge on a car with no engine. Now, the MINI Cooper JCW SE, which is the electric model, comes in at about 225,000 ringgit, although you have to add another 6,300 ringgit in order to get the full 4-year unlimited mileage warranty that is separate from the high voltage component warranty, which is 8 years. Now, in terms of motivation, you'll find this car being fed by a 54.2 kilowatt-hour battery, which feeds a single electric motor up front, which produces 258 PS and 350 Newton meters of torque, while the top speed is set at 200 kilometers an hour with a 0 to 100 time of just 5.9 seconds. Now, in terms of charging, this car will accept up to 95 kilowatt DC, which means a 10 to 80% charge takes about half an hour. Whereas in terms of AC charging, this car will accept up to 11 kilowatts, which means a broadly 5-ish hour charge from dead to full. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that the 3-door JCW is also available as a petrol model, which is powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder, although that car costs about 100,000 ringgit more. Now, although the Cooper JCW is available again as a petrol and an electric, actually visually there are some differences between the two which mark them out. So for example, up front, these headlights, for example, do not get their own individual surround shroud. Instead, you just get the full LED headlights here, replete with a customizable LED daytime running light signature which correlates both the front and the rear. And of course, up here, you also lose out on the upper air breathers. Instead, you just get an air dam instead in order to improve this car's overall aerodynamics, but there is still a space made out here specifically for the radar. In fact, the entire front lower bumper is a little bit different between this car and the petrol, because again, this is meant to be the car that accelerates a little bit faster, and as a result, there are some slightly different aerodynamic trickery being utilized up front in order to make that happen. Now, in terms of rolling stock, they ride on the same 18-inch diamond cut finish alloy wheels. The designs are exactly the same, but the tires are slightly different because the electric model runs on Goodyear Eagle F1 tires, whereas the petrol model utilizes Pirelli P7 Cinturato tires. Now, I suspect that this is down to the fact that these two cars are actually built in different facilities, and so the supplier availability for those two facilities would be dependent on the geography. Now, in terms of overall measurements, this car is broadly similar to what we saw from the MINI Cooper SE that we reviewed quite some time ago, but as you can tell, down the side there have been some changes to this car's visual appearance. So for example, again, the wheels are slightly different, but what I appreciate are the fact the center caps actually say JCW rather than MINI. It's a small thing, but it does look good. Another way to tell this car apart from the petrol model is actually from the door handles, because the petrol model actually uses those pop-out door handles, whereas these ones stay flush with the bodywork. And because this is a JCW, naturally you have slightly more pronounced side sills in order to make this car look a little bit squatter, but the overall body lines on this remain exactly the same. Your charging port is here, but another design feature that I quite like is this spoiler, which is again different from the petrol model compared to this electric, because on the electric model, the spoiler does seem to jut out a little bit further, and it comes with a John Cooper Works badge up here, which I think really sets off the side profile of this car and certainly makes it look a little bit more aggressive. And you can really take in that spoiler from this angle where you can see it's got fins up here on the top, and it even integrates the third brake light within that design feature, which I think looks quite good. At the rear, you have the same full LED tail lights, again with the customizable daytime running light signature, as well as the black MINI badge here, as well as Cooper and John Cooper Works badging there. Now, this sort of checkered decal here comes as standard for the JCW Electric, which I think does look quite good. Now, another point of differentiation is obviously the bumper, because with the petrol model, there is a center exit exhaust, which certainly makes the back end look a little bit more aggressive. But on the electric model, as you can see, a greater emphasis has been played towards aerodynamics in order to make this look like a more functional piece. And overall, I do think that the back end of the electric JCW looks a little bit better than that of the petrol model. Additionally, because this car has no engine, it therefore has no offensive fake exhaust noises. Now, in terms of overall practicality, the MINI 3-door isn't going to win any awards anywhere because this back end is not that large at all. Now, there is a dual level boot floor which improves the overall height capacity by about that much. but really you're not really going to get that much space back here. In fact, as you can see, we've left the 3-pin charger for this car on the boot floor because there is no space underneath that boot floor. There is like a little boxy type affair, but it's certainly not large enough to fit the charger. Now, of course, if you do need to load more stuff into this car, the rear seats do fold flat in a 60-40 split. But again, you're not really getting much here. It's a Mini 3-door, for heaven's sake. If you wanted boot space, buy an Aceman. Now, before I get into this interior, I would like to point out once again that the JCW Electric that I'm in now is about 225,000 ringgit retail, whereas the petrol model is 330,000 ringgit, which means there is a significant price gulf between the two. However, if you were to get into the interiors, you'd think, on paper at least, that the electric car must be the more expensive one, because there are some features in here that you can't get in that car. So for example, while both the electric and the petrol both have a glass roof, the electric model comes with a single pane glass roof replete with ambient lighting and an electric sunblind, whereas the petrol model has a 2-piece glass roof with 2 manual blinds, one over the front and one over the rear. The electric model also comes with this faux leather upholstery with electric seats on both sides replete with memory, lumbar and massage function for the driver, whereas the petrol model is purely manual. Now, aside from that, there are no other differences because, in terms of specifications at least, it remains the same. You get a wireless charging pad up front with a couple of USB-C ports, but they are mounted in the front, whereas in the petrol model, they are mounted in the middle. The center has also been slightly changed, where I have now a connected armrest connected to the driver's seat, whereas the little bin is now a little bit bigger and it lives down here instead. You get a couple of cup holders, that's always nice. A decently sized glove box, at least for a car of this size. However, it is hard plastic, which means that things will rattle about in there. You get decently sized door bins, big enough for a liter size bottle thereabouts, and overall, life in here is not that bad. Now that brings me on to the instrumentation in this car, which is a little bit of a hit and miss. Now, if you've watched our review of the MINI Cooper SE, the blue one, which I was absolutely besotted with, I did mention the fact that although everything is controlled within this screen, it is entirely livable because there is a heads-up display. Now, that opinion remains broadly the same in this, the electric model, simply because a lot of the functions that are in here are executed relatively well, except for when you're starting up the car, because it then feels like there are lots of things fighting for your attention. For example, every time I get in the car, it will first ask me to sign into my profile, and then I usually want to adjust the air conditioning settings, at which point my Android Auto is trying to take over, taking me away from that screen, which means there's a lot of jabbing and pressing before I can actually get going. And on top of that, while this is all pretty alright, the instrument cluster, on the other hand, is very limited in its capabilities, which means that any of the functions that you see here are not really replicated in that instrument cluster, even though the HUD software is broadly what we've seen from other BMW models. Now, talking about this specifically, the overall usability of it is kind of alright. Now, I can't stand this app drawer nonsense where they put all the icons, they look all the same, they are broadly the same color with the exception of being Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, both of which are wireless. But it does mean that when you're looking for a function on this, it can be a bit of a pain in the rear. This gets especially bad when you're trying to adjust your driving settings, because while we get the same mini steering wheel in terms of its overall design, it's a bit chunkier here with perforations here, as well as a John Cooper Works badge and some strapping down here, as well as a boost pedal, which I haven't had to use because this car is already really fast. If I want to adjust the follow distance on my adaptive cruise control, that's in the screen. So imagine if you have your Android Auto or Apple CarPlay running, it's giving you directions, running your Spotify, whatever. If you want to adjust your air conditioning, suddenly your smartphone mirroring goes away. If you want to adjust your follow distance, once again, you have to navigate out of your smartphone mirroring. Yes, you can just hit the home button on the bottom to bring you to the home screen, but again, it is one step too many, particularly given the fact that there is a gap here on the screen where you could have put follow distance adjustment. Now, talking about the heads-up display, as I've mentioned before, it is a flip-up type rather than something that is displayed directly on the windscreen. I suspect this has something to do with the geometry because the windscreen on this car is not as vertical, perhaps. I'm not sure. But Because it's a flip-up display, the amount of space that it has to display information is relatively small, and that does again limit the number of functions that you can have displayed on that heads-up display. Now, because this is the electric model, that's not so bad. Believe me, that heads-up display gets a lot more offensive in the petrol car. But aside from that, the other issue that I kind of take with this is in terms of quality, because again, this is a car that costs well over 200,000 ringgit. And so while use of the fabric here and the fabric here and a lot of the sort of ambient lighting displays and projections are all well and good, the majority of the panels in this car are not of particularly high quality. So for example, this is all hard plastic, this is all hard plastic, this is soft, but down here is more hard plastic. And even on the doors, while there may be fabric up here, the panel that holds the speakers, that's all hard plastic, which means that again, it doesn't quite feel like the sort of quality that you'd expect for something pushing over 200,000 ringgit. And once again, a lot of this is shared with the petrol model, which is over 100,000 ringgit more. It just feels like in this car, while they were moving towards trying to make everything look a little bit more minimalist for this generation of Mini, not specifically to the JCW, while they've made this kind of cool and interesting, and it is of course the first circular OLED screen to be used in the automotive industry, the rest of the cabin just does not seem to keep up with the progression of quality that you get with a lot of the features and specifications on this car. It just feels a little bit lacking, and I wish that they would go back maybe 1 or 2 generations perhaps to where Minis used to have properly nice interiors that were clearly inspired by BMW quality. Now, in the back of the MINI JCW Electric, it's actually not that bad because I have about that much knee room and about that much headroom. But more importantly, even though this is the electric model, the floor doesn't feel like it's ridiculously tall, and there is just about enough space for me to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. Now, because the back end of this car obviously only fits 2 people, there is actually some space to sort of man spread a little, and when you do, it's really not that bad, honestly. Of course, the backrest angle is a little bit upright. I have very few amenities back here. I've got like an armrest thing, but that's also hard plastic. There's a small pocket here. There are no pockets behind the rear seats. Forget about cup holders because there's only one here in the center. But of course, you do have 2 ISOFIX mounts back here, and there's 1 more ISOFIX mount on the front passenger seat, which means that, again, theoretically, this car could be decently practical as a family car. Although, again, this is a JCW. Now, although life back here is surprisingly good, I wouldn't say that this is a car that's made to carry passengers in the rear. If you're looking for an electric hot hatch, or ultra hatch in this case, that can carry rear passengers, you might be better served by something like a smart #1 Brabus, or even a #3 Brabus for that matter, for this money. And then you'll get significantly more space in the rear and of course a significantly larger boot. But of course the appeal of the MINI JCW, any MINI JCW, is the way it drives, and this electric is no different. Now, driving the Cooper JCW Electric is a bit of an interesting sort of experience because, for starters, this is very much a JCW, which means that you get the red stitching, you get the idea that this is a more exciting car to drive, and more importantly, you do get a significant amount more power than the regular Cooper SE. However, having just stepped out of the petrol model, there are a few things that jump out almost immediately. Firstly, the suspension in this car is not nearly as stiff as the one in the petrol model. Now, I suspect that it's because of the added weight of the battery pack sort of weighing down the suspension, giving it a much more supple ride compared to the unlawfully stiff suspension that you get in the petrol model. Now, as a result, what this car has that the petrol doesn't is more daily usability, because this car feels like a much easier car to live with on a day-to-day basis, which is essentially what you want out of a hot hatchback, and puts this car in line with other sort of hot vehicles within this space, such as the smart #1 Brabus, for example. The other thing that's important to note about this car is that because it has no engine, it means that the power delivery in this is instantaneous. That wasn't full throttle, mind you. And even when you do that, because of all the noises, etc., it just gives this car an experience as if it's actually surging forward with a degree of ferocity that you'd expect, again, from a vehicle like this, which is kind of what you want. Now, compared to the smart #1 Brabus, which I think is this car's essentially its biggest possible competitor, Now, compared to the #1 Brabus, this car feels like a much more driver-focused machine. The body control is much better than the #1. The ferocity is broadly similar, so you're not losing anything in terms of performance. And in terms of the driving feedback, because the pitch and roll of this car is very well controlled, and because you do get a certain amount of precision from the steering wheel, it also means that you tend to be more willing to take certain risks with this car, if risks is the right word. You're willing and more confident to take this car right up to the edge because you have a bit more trust and confidence in the car itself. And I think that for the very few looking for a performance electric car within this space, I think that the JCW Electric does a pretty good job at delivering on its promises. There are a few things about this car that I think are not so great, however. Firstly, because this is a 50 odd kilowatt hour pack, this car only does about 350 or 370 kilometers on a single charge, which isn't a lot, but it gets worse that if you were to drive this car the way it's intended, you're realistically going to get about 300 kilometers on a full charge. That's not so great. Number one. Number two, of course, is the matter of refinement, because I think that the JCW Electric suffers from the same problem as the MINI Cooper SE, whereby you get a pretty pronounced amount of road noise and a pretty pronounced amount of wind noise, which means that life in this car is never really as serene as you might necessarily expect from an electric vehicle. However, unlike the Cooper SE that we drove previously, this car does at least come as standard with all the active safety features that you might be looking for, which means that you get traffic jam assist, adaptive cruise control, AEB, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, a 360-degree camera, and automatic parking assist. Although I doubt very much anyone would ever use that in a car this small. But because those features are there, this does feel like a much more complete package as a whole. And so it does mean that if you do want a hot hatchback that you can drive every day to work and back and have a little bit of fun on the weekends, this feels like a much more complete and well-rounded package to do that. Now, of course, some of you may argue that the smart #1 Brabus also offers broadly the same feature set. Plus, that car has, back doors and more usable back seats. And you're right. If you want a more practical vehicle, this is most likely not it. In fact, even within the Mini lineup, if you wanted a vehicle that drives with the same sort of agility but offers a little bit more in terms of practicality, that is exactly why the Mini Aceman is also available as a John Cooper Works edition. And of course, for those of you who feel that there is no replacement for displacement, and more importantly, that the emotional connection driven by a combustion motor is something you simply cannot live without, then you'll just have to top out another 110 grand in order to get into a Cooper JCW petrol. However, I do think there is something to be said about this car. It does drive with a certain degree of agility and nimbleness that you just don't get in a lot of other EVs. This is, to me at least, very much part of the Mini experience and very much a part of the JCW experience. So the fact that this car drives the way it does is exactly what it ought to do, given the fact that this is a Mini Cooper Electric 3-door with a JCW badge. It is ferociously fast, it drives very well through corners, it has endless amounts of grip, and yes, it might not be the most comfortable thing in the world, nor the most refined, but neither was the actual Mini, so does it really matter? I don't think so. I think that this JCW Electric has dialed up the bits that are important to the JCW experience, and I think that this car delivers exactly what it needs to be a convincing electric John Cooper Works Mini. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2025 MINI Cooper JCW Electric. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh. Whee!